Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about establishing trust in AI. I'm Scott Zoldi, Chief Analytics Officer at FICO. I've been at FICO for 25 years. I've been a Chief Analytics Officer for 8, almost 9 years now. And I'm going to talk about why now, more than ever, it's imperative that we establish trust and governance in AI. One of the things that I've had a big pleasure doing over the last 25 years is applying and operationalizing AI, essentially focusing on how to solve business problems that impact people. I work for a company called FICO. FICO is responsible for monitoring about 2/3 of the world's payment card transactions for fraud on a continuous basis. We're also responsible for pioneering credit scoring, going all the way back to the 1950s. And so we understand that the AI that we develop has significant impact on individuals and on consumers. And as a result, right, there's a lot of responsibility that goes into developing these models. The last 8 years or so, I've been focused on responsible AI, the concept that not all AI is suitable for certain types of decisions. The EU Act is a great example of this, right? Trying to classify different AIs, very high risk or high risk. I would argue if it touches a consumer, it's all high risk, and we have to take that responsibility very seriously. Now, we don't have great examples. In fact, if you look at things like generative AI and large language models, it seems that we tolerate hallucination, we tolerate bias, right? We tolerate the fact that these models, no one understands how to explain. But that's not sufficient when it gets in the way of individuals getting their loans, allowing their children to go to schools, impacting their ability to buy a car. These are very serious decisions, and it's not the same as asking a large language model to tell me a limerick. And with that, what I want to do is talk more about what does it mean to build AI responsibly. Now, this is some survey results, right? KPMG talks about consumer confidence in AI. 61% are wary of trusting AI systems. 73% of consumers perceive very significant risks in AI. The middle is Forbes. Forbes is talking to some 7,500 different businesses across the globe. Businesses aren't much better, right? Although they may want to use AI or say they're using AI, 61% say that they're concerned about their ability to explain AI-powered decisions, to actually explain why they made a decision or did not make a decision. And if you look at just banks in North America, where I got this last survey result, same for bankers, right? Bankers are basically saying 75% want stronger guardrails around their use of AI. 80% concerned about nonsensical and inaccurate information generated by the Gen AI. And 57% talk about the fact that they have significant ethical concerns. So we are not in a great position today to use AI responsibly. And in fact, people notice, the regulators are noticing. Essentially what they're saying is consumer trust is a low, and we need to step in from a regulatory perspective. Whether it be the initial GDPR that talks about the fact that any automated decision needs to be explained to a human by a human, or recent EU Act where AI is now being termed as high risk, things like credit risk and credit scoring considered high risk. And even the United States, which is pretty far behind other regulatory motions, are talking about the wide-scale discrimination that can be propagated by these types of models. And so we're at a time when I'm having more and more conversations about a coming AI winter. For those of you that follow AI, AI has gone through hype cycles and troughs, where we had all this excitement around the technology. but found that we were unable to use it ethically, responsibly, and people retracted. And today, many organizations are retracting from using AI. That's a shame, because AI has a lot of promise in terms of affecting our businesses in very positive ways, and in fact, impacting us in positive ways. But we need to talk about the right AI. This is known as responsible AI. It's a term that I coined about 8 years ago. Many people talk about responsible AI now. Responsible AI is built on a set of pillars that establish that you've taken the time and the seriousness to build models appropriately. Responsible AI is how regulation can be met, and it's also how we can establish trust. But too often, when you ask people about responsible AI, they talk about, yes, they put their hands up, yes, we'll do good, right? But we do not have a set of standards as an industry, what is responsible use of AI? We have people that talk about that they can explain models with explainable AI, but they barely understand the algorithms, and they're insufficient. And so industry is trying to solve this problem, and they're trying to solve this problem through a set of pillars. I talk about 4 pillars when I talk about responsible AI. The first pillar is what's called robust AI. Robust AI is essentially understanding that when you build an AI model, it is something that you must take very seriously. It means that you've collected the data, you study the outputs, you understand the relationships that's being learned, you remove relationships, remove variables. This is not about loading data into a cloud and quickly spinning up a model. It's around building a model that might take months or maybe a year of human effort to make sure that you have tested it in so many different ways and you've secured how it was to be built properly. The second pillar here is around interpretable AI. Now, within the United States, where I'm from, the CFPB is a very powerful function. It's a Consumer Bureau of Protection. They talk about AI as being, the quote is, black boxes behind brick walls, okay? Nobody knows what's inside the black box. That's what makes them so scary. Neither the developers nor the people that are impacted by this. So interpretable AI is a type of algorithm that you can expose the relationships. You essentially constrain the way you build the model so that a human being can go look at the equation and understand exactly what is being learned so they can explain or justify its use. The third piece of this is ethical AI. I already talked about the fact that AI propagates bias, right? All data is biased, and when you build a model based on biased data, you get potentially a biased model. But you may not know how. There's no guarantee that the bias that you know that's in the data drives into the model. And so you need to test each of the relationships that are learned by these neural networks and other technologies for whether or not it exposes bias towards one protected group or another. And the last pillar here is around auditable AI. And that's really the focus of this talk. Every organization is trying to define what responsible AI is because they're trying to ensure that they have an ability to use AI in their operations moving forward. Audible AI is around providing that source of truth. It's around focused on how do I govern that I keep track of whether or not the model was built properly? Did I make the right decisions? Who made those decisions with me? And how can I drive accountability in terms of how we develop models? Now, this is a relatively new concept, audible AI. We somehow, today in industry, allow ourselves to have a situation where we just get amazed by the outputs. We don't insist that we understand how the model gets developed. And so audible AI, though, is going to be one of the only ways that we can demonstrate that we followed a proper development process. Now, why is it important? It's important because if you were running an AI shop you're going to run into lots of behaviors among scientists. Some of them don't care. They literally do not care. They either because they want to get done with their job and go home, maybe because they think they're smart enough that they have built it properly, and how dare anyone challenge that? But many don't care, unfortunately. Another group of scientists have very different views on how to attack a problem, such as making sure a model is ethical or not. And if you have large teams of 300, 400 data scientists, you can't have 300 and 400 different ways of solving for an ethical development of one of these models. And the third one is probably the most common. We simply don't know what to do, right? They're asked to build a model. They're asked if it's ethical or not. They do not have the tools. No one's prescribed it for them. These are very, very, very complicated models that are very difficult to understand. And so that requires that there is only one standard used in an organization. I often call this the Highlander method. There should only be one. And so data scientists need a guide, and organizations are responsible for defining those guides. So what does it mean? It means that an organization brings its key stakeholders together. These stakeholders have to sit around a table. They'll include people like myself, right, head of ad analytics or chief AI officer. It will include legal, governance, compliance, product managers, customer service. Everyone has to get around the table to define what is that standard for how the model development will occur within an organization. Today, if they get around the table, 43% of them say they do not know how to meet regulatory requirements around AI regulation. They simply don't know. And that's because half of them lack any kind of standard. So if Jack builds a model and Jill builds a model, Jack and Jill's models will be built entirely differently, odds are. And if you have many, many Jacks and Jills in an organization, then you have many different ways that models get developed. And so what happens is very often organizations will employ what they call governance teams. And the governance team will go in and do a verbal audit of what was developed and ask questions around whether or not it was built properly, which is error-prone, right? They might give me a pass because I'm chief analytics officer, where they should be scrutinizing me the hardest. Or they may not be familiar with the type of AI that a data scientist wants to use, and they don't know the questions themselves what to ask. And so we have this layering of Band-Aids on top of the main problem, which is very often people are building models with the wrong technologies and they don't know how to build appropriately. So governance then requires a single model governance standard. Organizations that want to employ AI are defining this standard, which means that every model that gets developed uses the same algorithms. It disallows certain types of practices. It says this is the way we, company A, will deal with explainability or ethics, and we will specialize in those algorithms, and we will defend that single algorithm to a regulatory body and ensure that we are the very best at doing so. Now, it includes a lot of components, things like proper problem formulation, ensuring that we have representative data, and recording that. Do we have a sufficient amount of outcome data, historical tags, to build this model? Are the people that I'm going to be subjecting this model to, are they represented in the data or not? What is that performance definition? What are the algorithms I'm allowed to use and not use? How do I select a model? What is the stability and robustness testing? When we develop this model, put it in production, we can't figure out 9 months later that it's not scoring properly or it's unethical. And what are the monitoring specifications? It's not just about building the model, it's also about monitoring the model and ensuring that we understand when do we stop using it. and under what conditions. Now, when I started in my career, it was 25 years ago at FICO, I think there were Jacks and Jills all over the place because models got developed in different ways. Some were good, some were less good. Less good meant they degraded quickly or acted unpredictably. And at that time, it was very clear that we needed to do something different. So about 15 years ago, I established what is called an analytic tracking document. Essentially, it's a paper document that describes who's working on the project, what are the success criteria, how will the models get built, what are the time frames, the sprints, and the data scientists had to physically sign the paper. I treated it as an employment contract. So there was no confusion around what the expectations were around how we developed these models. Now, the scientists, they liked it because they were clear on what was supposed to occur. I was feeling comfortable. And then we would go through agile development processes where, as they go through stand-ups every 2 weeks, we would go review the progress. And somebody would have to show in a meeting to myself or my managers how they met those requirements. A very manual process. Now, when blockchain became very, very popular, I had a CTO. He's no longer with us, but he challenged me. He said, well, there must be a perfect application for blockchain in our space. And I thought about it, and I think there is, in fact. Because I can take a document like this, which is a written document, and processes such as agile processes and stand-ups and project management around ensuring things are built properly, and extract what is important. What is important here is that any model development project consists of lists of requirements, sprints, resources assigned, the assumptions and success criteria, the data that will be used or not used, how you will explain that model so you can actually deploy it and use it with consumers, how you are focused on the bias, and then understanding who approved it, right? And what are those accountability tests? So any model development then is essentially a journey. And we need to know where we're going. Much like these fellows that are getting ready to go on their trip in Bolivia, you prepare. Now, if you couple this with blockchain, you have an ability to enforce. So for me, this is important. You set up front what the expectations are for the model development. You indicate what the success criteria are. You don't do it afterwards. You don't do it in the middle. You don't do it when there's business pressure to release a model because someone basically committed it to the CEO. You do it up front. It's a high level of honesty around what is expected of this model development build. And what's the role of blockchain? Well, blockchain here is my perfect tool, right? All of you in this room are much more expert in blockchain than I am. But for us, it was important that we have the immutability of every single decision that got made. Right? It needed to be cryptographically secure. I needed fault tolerance. And I could make it either public or private. Mine are private, but I can open it up to anyone that I need to open it up to inspect the chain. And the fact is, mistakes get made. And the mistakes will be on the blockchain too. That's the ultimate sort of transparency and honesty around being responsible with AI. Everyone makes mistakes. The point is that we are recording that to the blockchain so we have a full immutable record of what those mistakes were and what that journey looked like. So bringing these two things together, we have essentially auditable AI. We have all the expectations for how AI needs to be developed, and we have the blockchain to record that journey. And if a success criteria isn't met, the model isn't released. It's that simple. There is no backing away from what those expectations are. Now, it also involves people. which is a strange concept in AI, right? We're used to just throwing data at these machines, and very often we don't even know what the data is that they're trained on, including the large language models that are so popular today. But this is called human in the loop. And there are roles to play. So within this auditable AI concept, there are 3 significant roles. The first role is an assignee. That is the data scientist who's responsible for doing one of these requirements. Right? She's assigned to the requirement. She understands what the success criteria is. She's going to take that on. It's been assigned to her. It's her responsibility. There's a tester. That tester is under the same level of scrutiny. He needs to then go look at the asset when it's complete, and he independently verifies the success criteria is met. And finally, because you can't have 2 in collusion, you have a third, right? Someone like myself, someone where the buck stops, that reviews the asset and the testing results and will determine whether or not it was properly met. Now, when we first released this to the data scientists, there was a lot of objections, right? Because of the mutability, right? Everyone's afraid of being wrong and having that recorded to the blockchain. But they soon got over it, because what it allowed us to do is to show that we have the right intents. The intent to make sure that we're following a process. And so let me give you an example of what this looks like. So each step here is a transaction that's being put on the blockchain. So one is the description of the requirement. Here it's a bias requirement. There are 4 different types of bias that are going to be tested. There's a range of how much the distributions of how the latent features in this model will differ across the different protected classes. The assignees on the blockchain, the testers on the blockchain, the verifiers on the blockchain. There is no level of misunderstanding who's responsible for each of those steps. Later on, right, in red, Jalon does her work. She uses the bias detector, and she determines that she's extracted these latent features, the things that drive these neural networks and these AI models, and she says there's no bias. She's done her work, she's tested it. It's on the blockchain. Next comes Shafi. He's going to test. He's going to make sure that it's done properly. She's completed the task. He's assigned to this work. He determines that it's not done properly. Okay? That's on the blockchain. And so Jalon has to restart. And so in red, then she goes and updates this, finds the latent feature that's driving disparate impact between different groups, resubmits her work, and completes the task. And then the testing continues. Once again, testing. Did she indeed fix it? In this case, she did. And then comes the final verifier, who's going to make sure that this work was done correctly. That is the level of detail which is placed on this blockchain. And each and every model has its own blockchain with all the requirements and the journey that was made. This is around driving accountability. Accountability is through transparency. It's through our failures, and it's through our successes through this model development. Also, we established the states of each and every requirement. It's not a project management tool. This is to say where each of these requirements are. So the states are relatively simple in this most simple sense, right? We have in development, we have development complete, we have testing fail, testing complete, we have approved fail, or I, the verifier, would say no, both are wrong, and we have approval complete. And so we track each and every one of these requirements that we will share with the regulatory body in terms of how we are building the model, and show that we followed this process to get to the end of the approval complete. And what is important here, right, is there is no model released until approval complete is met on each and every requirement. It's simply a corporate standard. So does that mean that lots of models don't get released? Yes, it does. It certainly does. But that's what establishes that level of integrity when it comes to how we develop models. Now, we've now been using this for about 8 years. Just this year, there's a lot of visibility around AI and blockchain. And so I'm really proud that we have gotten to this point. But let me show you what it looks like to a scientist's perspective, because it's not like blockchain is something that everyone understands how to touch and feel, right? And so there's more to it, right? There's the user experience. So what does this look like for us? So we developed this around Hyperledger Fabric. We chose this because we felt it was best for our business from a corporate use. So we thought it was best for a business application. We also felt that we wanted to do it on the Linux Foundation. It's implemented in AWS, where we use EKS with multiple redundancy. We have multiple ECU. We use authentication, both AWS and our own authentication, to authenticate users into updating this blockchain. And we have a front end called FOB, which is related to how that UI experience will look like for the data scientist. It's important that we have redundancy, because this is the asset that we need to demonstrate compliance. It's also the asset that our data scientists will work with as they work through this. The user interface looks like this. Within this, we can see all the analytic tracking documents that are currently in process and those that are being planned. Each of these are being constructed to align with that model development standard, and each of these have to be approved by the verifier, by the business. It starts by defining an ATD, which essentially is focusing on what is this ATD, and generally what we're trying to accomplish. If we're building a mortgage model to make a decision around whether or not to originate a loan, we'll describe what that objective is. And then moreover, we go through all the requirements. And so every requirement.
Please feel free to join us for a drink at the food court. Please feel free to join us for a networking drink at the food court.
So each and every requirement is listed here, and each of those requirements then consist of different pieces. One is the description of the requirement, and then the roles. Who's assigned, who's the tester, who's the verifier. And finally, the acceptance criteria, which is tremendously important because the requirement is not met unless the acceptance criteria has been met. All of this is established before the project starts, and it's required for purposes of ensuring that we meet the standards of this model development. Assets are associated with this also. The asset may live on the blockchain, pointing to a proof of work that might exist in an additional sort of external store. So in this instance, right, the data scientist has indicated that she's done this work. She's measured what this bias variations are in the data across different protected classes. And she says, well, they're all below 3%, and she gives the ranges here. Again, persisted that blockchain along with those proof work assets. That's one also do analysis on. The tester comes in, likewise, does testing on a different data set, concurs that those success criteria are met on the blockchain. And then finally, the verifier comes in, same. In this case, I'd be the verifier. I have to review the work that the scientist did. I have to review what the tests were. And I might independently do the work myself if I feel uncomfortable. And so this analytic tracking document then gets to, these model developments get to the set of requirements that are in different states. As you can see here, a number of them are complete from an approval complete perspective, a number incomplete. And so this continues until each and every one of them are met. And at that point, we get to the point where no model is released until approval complete is met on each and every requirement and recorded on the blockchain. Okay? So the blockchain is the single source of truth. We know exactly what the requirements are. We know exactly what the success criteria are. And we automate the fact that no model can ever be released unless everything is satisfied on the blockchain. And if it's not, the project's canceled. There'll be a new set of requirements, a new type of model to be developed. But that is what it means to be responsible AI. And this chain lives with the model. The chain is defined for each and every AI model, which talks about how we develop the model and who's involved in it and how we've ensured that we've met all those requirements. But it's also the same chain that lives with this model. Every AI model should have a blockchain associated with it, which is that immutable record of how the model got developed. And the reason for that is the other major sort of ugly aspect of AI models is nobody knows how to monitor them either. So once they're in their production, it's very difficult to understand whether or not they're working properly or not. The only person that understood what you need to monitor is Jalan, the data scientist, when she built that model. And therefore, all the monitoring requirements are established when the model was developed. Because that modeler, she knew what the data was, she knew what the latent features were, she knew how it's supposed to behave. And she'll also specify when you pull it out of production. Also on this blockchain would be everything required for regulatory scrutiny. Today, people are scouring the EU Act, trying to figure out what sort of requirements they need to meet to ensure that they can use their AI models in the coming age. All of those things will be codified and contained on the blockchain. We're not looking to do audits where somebody calls us in and asks us questions about the models. The model should be released with everything that's required from an audit perspective. And so hopefully, right, this makes sense. The blockchain ensures you've built to a standard. The blockchain lives with that model so you can understand how to enforce how it's supposed to be used in production, but also how you can share that it's been built responsibly and to be used in a regulatory environment. Now, as I said, my first application was 8 years ago. We got a patent on this, and we're proud of that. We've operationalized it in everything that we do at FICO, and in fact, it's going to back-end our entire AI platform. Just this year, I've seen a tremendous amount of uptake in this concept of blockchain being the killer app for AI. We have a major trust issue. I put the Wall Street Journal there. Wall Street Journal headline was, AI has a trust issue. It is one of the only things that people are talking about when there's any oxygen left in the room after they talk about generative AI is the fact that nobody trusts the output. And it's not just the Wall Street Journal, right? The World Economic Forum had an hour on this topic. So I feel that this will be the killer app. It's one of the ways that we can enforce how AI is built properly, and we can ensure that it's done in ways that we can all benefit from the power that AI and machine learning brings, and do so responsibly. In summary, AI has a trust issue. It simply does. If you all trust AI, I feel sorry for you, right? And I build AI models for a living. There is a trust issue because there's there's good, bad, and ugly, but most AI models are bad and ugly. And so it's up to us to ensure that models are built properly. Regulation will insist on auditability. It will get stronger, it'll get harder, and in fact, some people will retreat from AI. I don't think we're going to be in an AI winter, but I do think there's going to be a lot of restrictions placed on the use of AI, where and how. I see blockchain as the killer app. I see it as enabling auditability of AI models. I see it as an ability for me to enforce that models are built to a standard, and for me not to argue about 5,000 models with 5,000 regulators, but for me to argue about a development standard with the regulators and ensure that everything meets that standard. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about leveraging blockchain then to ensure that it is met. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two questions if there are any. And if not, I'll allow you to go get drinks. Questions? Over here, please.
What is your perception on the decentralization of GPUs? Do you think it's doable from a technical perspective?
It's an interesting question. My initial reaction is it's not possible. This concept of federated learning from an AI perspective is very, very popular, but so far we've seen challenges in terms of the level of sophistication that these models can be when you kind of federate. So maybe in a few years, but today I don't feel that's the best approach. And then on top of that, right, the other aspect of this is, frankly, people are building models that are far too complex. I think most of the models that we would use to go about our lives don't require huge amounts of GPU, frankly, right? Obviously, chatting with my chatbot, right, or my Gen AI requires a lot of GPU power. But to make a decision around who's a good credit risk or to stop fraud, I don't need a huge model, right? And then I think that's the other sort of challenge, right? One of the reasons I got into this is because I think we've become too accepting that we need all that sort of heft, when in reality we don't. But right now I don't think so. I think there'll be other methods that'll come first.
So my question will be, do you think integrating blockchain with the AI, we will completely lost control of the things we want to control? Or is it possible, or is it not? So basically, most of the companies, they really want to have a control on their business, everything. I guess you understand. Do you think it? I think we may lost control of the integrating AI with the blockchain, but it will be helpful for us, or how it become disadvantages to us. So can you please elaborate that?
Yeah. So I think blockchain will be an enforcer. And that's why I use the term enforcer, right? I actually believe that blockchain can set the standards for what's acceptable or not acceptable. So when we talk about agents and they're interacting with each other, and all of a sudden, we had a conversation at the panel this morning about synthetic data, myths being propagated through models and models and models. Things like blockchain can allow us to put on the guardrails and make them very hard. The same way, for example, that models won't be released until all those requirements are met with success criteria are the same sort of, if you will, gates and keys that we've placed on AI models, right? In terms of what they have access to, but also when they're allowed to go live, for example. So I think that it will be beneficial for sure. I also think it's a good way for putting sort of protections around AI gone wild. Thanks.
Right, hang on 1 second.
Firstly, thanks so much for your presentation. I found it very encouraging that there are people working on this clear and evident problem. One point that I didn't quite understand is whether or not there are standards for disclosing this stuff. So the topic was auditability of how these models are developed, and I understood all that, and that's awesome. That was very clarifying. But how would I, as just an individual citizen, audit the way that FICO had developed their models for credit score, for example? Is there public endpoints? I think you get my question.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, there is no sort of standard. If you even look in the United States, which has some of the longest sort of laws around fair credit lending, they never specify what discrimination looks like, or right? And so they leave it to each and every institution to describe what that is. So from a consumer perspective, and from a industry perspective, disclosure of how we address that, right, will be one of the aspects, right? Now, it may not be something that would go directly to a consumer and say, hey, you have access to what this looks like. It may be delegated to a regulator. It might be delegated to someone else from an IP perspective. But there is a challenge. There's not one standard. And so, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, can you share what those standards are for another company, right? And certainly I'd love to, right? I think, in fact, one of the things that I've been focused on is in cybersecurity, right? They have this concept of ISACs, right? Groups of industry groups that come and define their own. And there might be a different standard for financial services than there will be for telecom, than will be for energy. But we need that shared sort of standard, and because it's not being defined for us. The best that you can hope for today in industry is that you have some forward-looking companies that have defined it, and they're very firm on it. And the regulators are just thrilled with that, right? Because it takes it out of their hands. And then, put on top of things like the audible AI or blockchain to enforce it, and then people start to establish trust. But that's generally how that will work. But I do think that the consumer aspect is super important because, fines and other things obviously impact organizations, but they're not that impactful at the end of the day. What's impactful is when consumers lose trust in a brand, right? And that's where this concept of what do you do for responsible AI, how do you do that across your organization is really, really important. And I think now that generative AI hype has started to decline and regulation is coming up, you're going to see more and more organizations sharing more of that and establishing that trust.
Right. So public auditability.
Correct. Yeah, and accountability, frankly. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we need to consider the standard for the jurisdictions because every country have their own compliance, regulatory, and depending on what to share, what not to share from the ethical AI standards, right? So, do we have any quantitative measures to make sure this is aligned, especially for global companies where they have multiple countries and where they have joint ventures?
So it's a work in progress. So I'm using the EU Act as one of the frameworks that I'll apply globally. So like in the United States, we don't have kind of a federal mandated regulation. We have a set of guidance that we should follow. But then in California and New York, Montana, states are starting to replicate it. So I think most organizations that are global organizations like FICO is, right, we have to look at what is the superset of all regulation and then, apply that in each of these domains that we're in. It's still an act in process. There's not one global sort of measure. But fortunately, from my view, the EU Act is a really good start for codifying, okay, what are those things that we're going to need to show in other locales and in different types of regions. The tricky part with things like the EU Act, though, is that they have this concept of what's high risk and very high risk, right? And they don't go through every use case, right? And so some of this is basically to dictate, this application is high risk, therefore we must do all these things. And then, there might be another application. For example, if you want to use Gen AI to allow your employees to look at, let's say, documentation, or to learn from that through an LLM, maybe that's not, right? Because the employee knows that these things hallucinate. They know that they shouldn't trust it, right? And so that's around classification of AI. So both exercises are happening. One is the superset of all that regulation. The other one is to kind of go through all the different AI applications that are out there in an organization and try to quantify which ones would fall into which regulation. It's still a work in progress for many organizations, though.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, it looks like that's time. Thank you very much.